Last weekend, 70 Christians were beheaded for their faith inside of a church, and you probably didn't hear about it until right now. We all remember the London terrorist attack that targeted Muslims, killing one man, and how it rightly dominated headlines. But when it comes to 70 Christians, the media is virtually silent. And this isn't just an oversight, it's part of a much bigger problem. A pattern that reveals something deeply disturbing about what's really happening in our world. And once you see it, you won't be able to unsee it. To understand why this happened, we need to go back to the slow but steady rise of Islam in Congo. For most of its history, Congo was a Christian majority nation, thanks to the missionaries who built schools, hospitals, and churches in the late 19th century. But after independence in 1960, something changed. Islamic communities, once restricted, were now free to organize and expand, and this set the stage for the tragedy that happened last week. The group behind this massacre is known as the ADF, the Allied Democratic Forces, who are associated with ISIS and founded by this man, Jamil Makulu, a former Catholic and convert to Islam. So here's what happened. It was early in the morning of February 12th when the ADF struck. Armed militants stormed the homes of Christians, yelling for them to come outside. Terrified families woke to the sound of gunfire and screaming, and one by one, they were dragged from their homes at gunpoint and were kidnapped and forced to march with the militants. Now, this happened over the span of a few days as they gathered nearly 100 Christians and forced them to carry loot for them as they continued to gather more Christians and killing those along the way who couldn't physically endure. Now, all of this kept going on until eventually they arrived at a Protestant church in eastern Congo. Once inside, the Christians were tied up, tortured, and then one by one, sadly, they were beheaded. Mothers, fathers, and children all slaughtered inside of their own church. The bodies of over 70 victims, including women, children, and the elderly, were found inside the church the next day. Now, as tragic as the story is, it should have been international news, but chances are you hadn't even heard about it until now, and there's a growing sentiment among people who believe that the reason why is because the victims were Christians. Unfortunately, this isn't the first time that the media has ignored Christian persecution, which is why it's more important than ever to know when the news is being selectively reported, and that's where today's sponsor comes in, Ground News. Ground News gathers articles from over 50,000 sources and shows you how they're being covered across the political spectrum, letting you see the full picture. So, for example, when it comes to this story about the massacre in Congo, only 46 sources have covered it so far, and out of those, only 3 of them are left-leaning. And if you go over here to the bias comparison tool, you can also see how the left, the right, and the center are all covering the same story. The right correctly emphasizes how it was Christians that were beheaded, while 2 of the 3 sources reporting it on the left refer to them as missing people. The bias couldn't be more clear. Another feature that I love is the blind spot feed, which highlights stories that are disproportionately covered by one side of the political spectrum. So if you look at this story right here, only 13% of right-wing outlets covered the fact that the rebels in Congo have killed over 7,000 people this year, and that is a massive blind spot. So Ground News has become a valuable tool for me, especially as a Christian seeking truth and integrity in media. And if you want to try Ground News today, just go to groundnews.com/whatdoyoumeme and get 40% off of unlimited access with the Vantage plan. All right, now back to our video. So we left off with this growing sentiment of people who believe that the reason why the media hasn't covered this story is because the victims were Christians.
Why is no one reporting this? Why does no one seem to care? If you were to replace 70 Congolese Christian with any other minority group, 70 Palestinians were beheaded, 70 people at a pride parade were beheaded, this would be the biggest news story of the decade. And yet this just happened and no one's reporting on it. And literally crickets.
Because these were Christians, Congolese Christians, the world just seems to shrug.
And it's not hard to see why people feel this way. I mean, compare the mainstream coverage of the Congo massacre to this story. In 2017, a man drove a van into a group of Muslims near the Finsbury Park Mosque in London, and in the attack, a 51-year-old man was tragically killed and 9 others were injured. This attack made global headlines. CNN, BBC, The Guardian, nearly every major outlet covered it extensively. The UK government even released an official statement condemning it, and politicians all around the world spoke out. But when it comes to not just one Christian, but 70 that were killed for their faith, Well, apart from Fox News, at least at the time of this recording, there seems to be complete silence from the major media outlets. And this isn't just a one-time thing. Christians are being murdered for their faith all around the world, yet the media barely acknowledges terrorist attacks that target Christians. And even when they do, they never talk about the real cause driving virtually all of it. If you want to know why terrorism targeting Christians keeps happening, take a look at this map. This shows the places where Christians are the most persecuted and have a high risk of being killed for simply being Christian. Notice anything about these regions? If not, take a look at this map. This right here is a map of where the Muslim population is the highest. And here's where we start to see a pattern emerge. And finally, look at this map. This one shows where the most terrorist attacks occur. So now, at this point, the connection is undeniable. Not only is most of the world's terrorism generated by those claiming to be Muslim, but these radical Muslims seem to account for virtually all of the terrorist attacks that specifically target Christians for simply being Christian. They're systematically hunting down Christians worldwide, and there's a reason for that.
Reason why you have to fight them is because they are Jews and Christians. You should fight those empires around you, or those hukumat around you, which are Jew or Christian, until they give the jizya. That's fine. That we already know Islam allows.
Quran 9:29 says to fight those that don't believe in Allah. And Surah 9:5 even goes further, ordering them to kill the unbelievers wherever you find them. These verses and more, even in the hadiths, say to target people based on what they believe. And ever since these verses were documented, until today, we see a small percentage of Muslims actively targeting and killing Christians because they believe that they're commanded by Allah to do so. Now, these beliefs are dangerous, destructive, and completely incompatible with any free society. But instead of calling them out, the media defends them. And rather than condemning the ideology behind these attacks, they stay silent, or worse, they label anyone who speaks out as Islamophobic. And meanwhile, Christian values, the very values that protect and give these journalists human rights, are ignored, dismissed, or even attacked. They don't realize it, but doing so is actively working against their self-interest and in a very dangerous way. If you were to compare across history, whenever Christian ethics have shaped a nation, that nation tends to improve. And when Islamic ideology dominates, we actually see the opposite. And this has been confirmed and documented in places like this. This study from Cambridge showed that Christian majority countries scored from medium to very high when it came to human development, whereas most of the countries that scored the lowest in human development had an Islamic majority population. And in predominantly Muslim countries, we often see things like lower levels of political freedom, educational attainment, and social inclusion, and it's really not hard to see why. At core, Christianity teaches that everyone, including every single Muslim, is made in the image of God and are infinitely valuable. Therefore, everyone is deserving of dignity and human rights. This is why Christian countries tend to have broad protections for all faiths and beliefs. In Christian countries, Muslims are allowed to be Muslim, or they're free to convert to any other religion. But Islam, however, rejects the idea that humans are made in God's image, and that belief has real consequences. This is why leaving Islam will earn you a death sentence in multiple Muslim countries. Freedom of speech? Also restricted, because many Islamic nations enforce blasphemy laws, making it illegal to criticize Islam, which is even punishable by imprisonment or execution. So, given these facts, Christianity fosters peaceful relationships and protects human rights, and Islam simply doesn't. That is, unless it's influenced by Christian ethics and freedoms. Of course, there are exceptions to this fact, and you can find exceptions on both sides. But the overwhelming pattern is still clear. Where Christianity spreads, freedom and prosperity follow. And where radical Islam takes hold, freedoms vanish and societies decline. So now, here's the real question in all of this. If the media isn't run by Muslims, then why are they so quick to defend Islamic theology while ignoring the countless Christians being slaughtered because of it? Well, there's actually a few answers to this question, and Jesus already told us about one of them. The world will simply hate Christians for his name's sake. And when I say that, with that in mind, we still have to be honest. Some of the time, we aren't hated because we're following Christ, but instead for doing wrong or mistreating others. And Jesus never said that persecution was a virtue in itself. If we suffer, it shouldn't be because we're doing wrong, but because we're doing good and are reflecting Christ. As Peter said, if you suffer for doing good and you endure it, this is commendable before God. To this you are called because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps. And if you think about this example for Christ, he didn't do anything wrong, but the world still hated him enough to kill him. And unfortunately today, the same thing is happening to our brothers and sisters in Congo and across the world who are not being killed for crimes, not for violence, but simply because they follow Christ. But we can take peace in knowing that their deaths are not in vain. It's part of the very story that Christ told us would unfold. Unlike these terrorists, we don't prepare ourselves to kill for Christ. We prepare ourselves to die for Christ because we love him, just as he prepared to die for us because he loves us. And that love transforms us from the inside out, not into people who harm others, but instead to people who love everyone, even those who want to kill us. That's the power of the gospel, and that's what makes Christianity unlike anything else. So pray for our brothers and sisters around the world who are actively being persecuted for his name's sake. And then be sure to share this video so that way people can see the truth that the media won't tell them. Let's make sure that this truth gets out. All right? See you guys in the next one.